All right, I think we can start already. I see that we're live on Facebook, so hello everyone who watch us here on Zoom as well as on Facebook. Welcome to this discussion. My name is MARYLIA HUSHCHA. I'm research assistant at the International Institute for Peace in Vienna, and I will be moderating this event today, where we will discuss Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine. And we have three distinguished speakers from each of these countries who will talk a little bit about their specific countries as well as regional dynamics, relations between the countries, and so on. So maybe as a short introduction to the whole event, I would like to share with you how we actually at the IIP came up with this idea to discuss these three countries together. So we noticed that whenever in Europe, at least, we speak about Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, we never speak about all of them together. We always speak about Russia and Ukraine, maybe with the European Union relations, or Belarus and Russia and Eurasian Union and things like that. But we never combine those three countries despite their geographical proximity, despite their close cultural ties, common historic past, and so on. So, and with the events in Belarus, with the political crisis that started 3 months ago, we also heard more discussions about how will Russia react to the situation in Belarus and whether it will be something similar as what happened in Ukraine 6 years ago. And so we decided to put together speakers from all these three countries to talk about how they see these developments in Ukraine and Belarus, how Russia sees these developments as well. And this is what we're going to do right now. So I will start with our Ukrainian guest, who will give his introductory input. His name is KAPITONENKO, and he is an expert in foreign policy at International Center for Policy Studies and associate professor at the Institute of International Relations of Kyiv National Taras Shevchenko University. So MYKOLA, you have 10 minutes and the floor is yours.
Thank you, MARYLIA. This was a brilliant and a brand new idea to talk about Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus together. Something which can bring about absolutely new insights and help understand regional security and threats all three states, regardless the conflicts and differences among them, are facing together. I'm going to concentrate on several issues, and the first of them is Russia's role in Ukraine's domestic politics before and after 2014. My general point is that the annexation of Crimea and Russia's decisions towards Ukraine, which have been taken in 2014, demanded some political price. And that price was included losses in regional influence for Moscow, as well as decrease of its influence in neighboring countries. And Ukraine was certainly first of them. So in my view, what we have today is a relative rise of the political forces which tend to support the idea that there's some sort of negotiations and agreement is needed between Ukraine and Russia. They are so-called pro-Russian political forces, although they are not pro-Russian, but symbolically they are called like this. And they symbolize and embody the Russian influence remnants of the Russian influence, political influence in Ukraine. What used to be quite huge before 2014, and Russia enjoyed a considerable amount of public support, the ideas of being closer to Russia politically, internationally, economically, have been quite popular. And Russia's positions have been quite strong in Ukraine's political community, not only because of influence on President Yanukovych, but also generally. That all has gone. And now a Russian factor in Ukrainian policy has turned into a rather political technology than an important factor of decision-making. Any attempts to enhance Russian lobby faces limitations. So if we imagine that pro-Russian parties, which are currently associated with Viktor Medvedchuk, a quite extraordinary figure, which is ascribed a host of negative connotations. If we imagine Medvedchuk is replaced by someone else, it will still be difficult to get more than 30% of public support in whatever elections. So In my view, in that sense, Russia's capabilities of influencing what is happening in Ukraine have considerably diminished. And because of that, people in Kremlin do understand that. And I guess they have switched from trying to bring Ukraine back into the Moscow's sphere of influence to minimizing risks which may be coming from anti-Russian Ukraine. The second point I was going to concentrate on is the future of relations between Ukraine and Russia and Belarus. They are both problematic, but certainly in a different way. Russia is defined as a key threat in the recent national security strategy, which has been signed by President Zelensky about a month ago. And on the other hand, Belarus, together with Moldova, fall into the category of a pragmatic relationship. That obviously means that we would like to keep relations with Belarus, given the deep political crisis there, as close as possible, minimizing risks and keeping cooperation going. But on the other hand, this dilemma which Ukrainian leadership faced after elections in Belarus has been affecting bilateral relations. It has been felt that the president and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs were hesitating between two options, and as it usually happens in Ukrainian foreign policy, took a position in the middle. And so far, we still have to wait and see what kind of a model for Ukrainian relations will be developing. Russia is a different story. Russia is seen as an existential threat, as the country which needs containment. And the Russian factor is, in that sense, making a significant influence on Ukrainian foreign policy in general. We seek for allies, we define potential partners, and we also define potential threats because of the Russian factor and Russian influence on our security. We need a long-term strategy of dealing with Russia. That is something I keep saying, and something which has not been addressed properly still, although some attempts have been taken recently in trying to figure out what kind of cold peace we could have with the Russian Federation. A part of that, and a third issue I'm going to talk about, is the ongoing conflict in Donbas, a conflict which has been so heavily discussed, and so many hopes have been connected to the new administration of Zelensky and his attempts to find a new formula for the dialogue with Russia and try some resolution and try to find some resolution to the conflict. Certain steps have been taken in last year, including disengagement of forces, exchange of detained persons, and holding the summit of Normandy format. But that was not enough. And as soon as the process approached the fundamental political issues, which proved to be costly and risky for Zelensky, and they included elections, return of control over the border, amnesty, and changes into Ukrainian legislation, the process has stopped. And today it's pretty on the same track as it used to be under President Poroshenko, with the whole set of same difficulties and unresolved problems. The question is now, who is losing more, whether it is Russia or Ukraine, because of an ongoing conflict. And also the point is in the strengths of the spoilers who are trying to damage the peace process from the sides of both Russia and Ukraine, and from the so-called DNR, LNR as well, for sure. The Crimea issue is my fourth point, and it is a very short one. It is an absolutely complicated issue, something Russians are not willing to discuss, unlike the conflict in Donbass, but something Ukraine is trying to keep in focus. We have recently launched the so-called Crimean platform, our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is designed to arrange international dialogue over the Crimean issue, to engage countries which may be interested in discussing and resolving the problem. It will contain of several elements which would encompass contacts between politicians, meeting of experts, probably annual forum and things alike. So this is all news concerning Crimea, which we recently had. And my final point is about the influence and the impact of American elections on regional security and on Ukraine as well. Lots of people are very enthusiastic in Kyiv about the victory of Joseph Biden, but I wouldn't be so optimistic because, in my view, American administration have reached a long-term consensus over its Ukrainian policy, and it has been reached long before the elections and probably even before Trump became president. The American policy towards Ukraine is very sustainable. Its key elements have been laid out during Obama administration, and they include sanctions against Russia, but the unity of the West in keeping them, keeping dialogue with Russia open over strategic issues which are important for the West. Also, attention to regional energy security, which has been embodied in Trump's sanctions against Nord Stream 2 project, and generally his quite high emphasis to the issues of energy security in Eastern Europe. I think this will be continued under Biden. And also providing Ukraine with technical and financial assistance, which has been accompanied also by the decision of Trump's administration to supply weapons to Ukraine, also a trend which will be continued under Biden. We have roughly about $500 million annually being given to Ukraine by the United States in support. We also have diplomatic and political support, which will continue. But I think it is unlikely that even under Biden, who knows Ukraine pretty much, who has been for 6 times in Kyiv as a vice president and was paying special attention to Ukrainian issues, I don't think that he is likely to significantly expand those amounts of assistance. I don't think he is likely to seriously discuss the issues of possible membership of Ukraine in NATO, or even providing Ukraine with a major non-NATO ally status. And I don't think I'm not even sure that he will one day pay a visit to Kyiv as the American president. The last visit in Kyiv of the US president we had was in 2008 by George W. Bush. So I think that we have pretty high chances for the situation being stable in relations among our 3 states and in the region in general. It will be tough, problematic, unpredictable in some way, and this stance of continued conflict will be negatively affecting all 3 countries, unfortunately. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, MYKOLA, for this very comprehensive analysis of all the issues. Maybe just a very short follow-up question, if you comment in 2 sentences. So you mentioned Donbas and the lack of, some kind of, positive agenda there, that it's more or less trying to sustain what's achieved, to minimize, the risks of anti-Ukrainian position in Russia and so on. Just recently, there was a plan proposed by Leonid Kravchuk within Trilateral Contact Group that sort of promises that the conflict will be resolved very soon, and even more specifically promises to hold local elections already in 2021 in the Donbas region. What do you think of this plan, or are there more details about it somewhere?
No way it's going to happen, because Ukrainian delegation in Trilateral Contact Group does not have any influence over decision making. It is represented by the politicians from the past, which are believed to provide some legitimacy for what is happening. The former president Kuchma has been replaced by the former president Kravchuk. But the problem is that, in my view, they sort of try to balance what the office of the president's office doing with what they are saying. So when the office takes specific steps which make the conflict stay the stance it is. Then we hear rhetoric from the Ukrainian part of the trilateral contact group about some promises for the pro-Russian, let's say, call it like this, a pro-Russian part of Ukrainian population, especially on the eve of elections. Moreover, we had a ceasefire. Actually, it is still operational. A ceasefire which has been established on the 27th of July and is lasting for more than 100 days. And this is unprecedented in the whole history of this conflict. And that ceasefire has been very important for Zelensky because this has been the only promise he was able to deliver before the elections. Bringing peace to Donbass was a key slogan with which he won the elections, presidential elections last year. And being unable to execute reforms or to make any other successes, he pretended that the ceasefire we had was the peace he promised. And that was very important for him. And I think a part of the prize was declarations by Kravchuk about soon settlement of the conflict or even resolution, which certainly would need to include the issue of elections, because this is number one issue for the whole, whatever scenario you take, the most important issue would be elections in occupied, non-controlled territories. So something had to be said. Kravchuk did that, but I don't think that it is going to be a practical plan for moving further.
Thank you very much. Now I would go to our Belarusian expert, and that's YAUHENI PREIHERMAN, who is director of the Minsk Dialogue Council on International Relations. YAUHENI, the floor is yours. 10 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, MARYLIA, and thanks a lot for putting the event together and for having us. It's great to see quite a few friends among the audience. I think I'll focus on four somewhat different points. Firstly, I'll try to draw some differences between Belarus and Ukraine, which in my opinion are important to keep in consideration when we analyze or we compare the current political crisis in Belarus to what happened in Ukraine a couple of years ago. Secondly, I'll talk a little bit about the Russian factor and Belarus-Russia relations in the context of the political crisis in Belarus. Then a couple of words on Belarus-Ukraine relations. And finally, I'll talk a little bit about how we can understand what's happening and is going to happen to the Belarusian foreign policy in the context of this crisis. So firstly, on the differences between Ukraine and Belarus, and I'm sure we can discuss it in further detail later on, and MYKOLA will have a lot to add to this. But I think we need to realize that there is a significant difference in the nature of the political systems in the two countries. Whereas Belarus is this consolidated authoritarian regime, which for more than 26 years now has had this central figure of the president who has controlled everything and has pretty much stifled everyone else, including all the other institutions. Most of the institutions which are technically supposed to be representative institutions, like, for example, the parliament, have rather been rubber stamp institutions and have rather represented the will of the president. But also importantly, the political space here in Belarus has not allowed much room for this notion of oligarchy. Technically, we don't even have oligarchs in Belarus, at least if you think that, if you define oligarchs as those who not only possess sizable economic power, but can transform that power in the economic realm into political influence. So this has been pretty much absent from the Belarusian context. And perhaps, if you will, President Lukashenko has been the only oligarchs, but also everything else within this political system. This is important because this predetermines the nature of the political crisis and also limits the possibilities to manage this crisis from all sides involved, be it the government, which until very recently did not even want to recognize that any problems did really exist in society, and they thought that the problems were marginal And even if they saw some manifestations of political problems, they thought that by using either violence or just their political power, they would be able to stifle those problems. As we now see, the situation within the country has reached the point where this is no longer the case. But at the same time, which is also different, and which is why I wanted to talk a little bit about this comparison between Belarus and Ukraine, given that the government of Lukashenko is still powerful enough to survive for the time being, and despite all the problems he's facing, he still manages to sit in his presidential chair. You cannot really hope for any solutions which help to resolve the previous crisis in Ukraine to work here in Belarus. So in a way, if you wanted to put it a little bit simplistic, it was only if the Protestant side, if the opposition could generate not only predominant societal support, but also could have a proper, let's say, dialogue with those representing the government system before the crisis broke out. And the dialogue was supposed to ensure that if society demonstrates to the governing apparatus that it predominantly does not support Lukashenko, then those people on the governmental side would understand that they have proper counterparts on the side of the protest who would ensure their own security if they accept the other side. Which, as in the case of Ukraine, was different, because when you have some sort of, a more dynamic political system with a huge presence of oligarchs, this whole negotiation is different, and you can rely on negotiations between the powerful groups, including oligarchs themselves, to make sure that you reach a balance which allows, first of all, perhaps to prevent a crisis from breaking out. But then after a crisis has broken out, you can use that communication space to make sure that the country moves out of the crisis rather quickly. So in Belarus, we don't really have this. And as a result, what we have is a stalemate, and this crisis is set to be quite prolonged, even though a lot depends on Russia, and I'm going to talk about this in a while. But also, another two differences which I think are important and which exist between Ukraine and Belarus have to do with society at large, and also with the structural conditions of Belarus in the system of international relations and regional security. So on the societal level, unlike Ukraine, we of course never had this significant crack or division internally in society, which was about geopolitical differences. Belarusian society has been more homogenous, and in a way it has been, I will not say pro-Russian, but really Russia-friendly, for a very pragmatic reason, first of all. And of course, you can find a lot of historical and cultural reasons for that. But pragmatically, when you look at those public opinion surveys, which are still available here in Belarus, and we do have a problem with public opinion surveys, but those which are available tell you that Belarusians are a very pragmatic nation, because whenever you ask a question whether you want to be with Russia or with the West, people would usually say they want to be with both, even if politically this is not particularly feasible. And for this very reason, you can see that the main slogan of this protest is that it is non-geopolitical, and that people do not want any geopolitics to be involved in this. Finally, on a structural level, the level of Belarus dependence on Russia, not only in economic terms, but also in terms of security and Belarus' own ability to provide for its own security, is different from Ukraine's, because Ukraine, if anything, was and perhaps still is the biggest European country. And of course, the potential of this country is incomparable to what Belarus has. And that's why, again, it explains why even the protest is so unwilling to accept any geopolitical narrative. Now, very quickly, the Russian factor. Obviously, we see that Russia has become a kind of a kingmaker within the context of this crisis we have in Belarus. That is to say, everything is still possible in Belarus, but nothing is possible if the Russians say a definite no to this or that scenario. This is not to claim that Russia has a free hand in doing whatever it wants here, because you still have Lukashenko, who remains an actor and who has his own interests. You still have this growing societal voice, which is growing in an unprecedented way. But again, because of all the structural dependencies, and because what we saw in August, when Lukashenko was not Lukashenko, Russia was the ultimate voice, which made sure that Lukashenko stayed in power, when many people in Belarus jumped into this premature conclusion that he was already done. So now that they have back, as soon as they continue to back Lukashenko, he's almost sure to stay in power. And they are backing Lukashenko, I think. Of course, Yulia will have more to add here, but I think for two very clear and easy to predict reasons. So the first one is geopolitical. Lukashenko now, with the Western dimension of his foreign policy completely broken, is sort of predictable for Moscow. And at least they can be assured that for the next several years, even the type of balancing act which Lukashenko pursued in previous years would not be possible. Whereas anyone new, including, for example, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who herself was trying to make this case that she was not at all anti-Russian, would still bring a lot of uncertainty for Moscow. And secondly, on a philosophical level, I don't think that people who make decisions in Moscow are ready to accept this idea that post-Soviet leaders can be overthrown by mass protest, even though we do have some cases, for example, in Armenia, but that's a different story. Belarus-Ukrainian relations are obviously at their lowest point now, and this is a huge deal for everyone, I think. We just had a series of closed-door track-2 discussions with our Ukrainian colleagues last week, and I mean, as much as we all understand the potential damage this is going to have for both sides, and for example, in the Belarusian case for the sovereignty of Belarus, it's really difficult to start talking about some solutions at the moment. But if anything, for Ukraine, this situation might potentially mean the reconfiguration of some security arrangements, and not only for Ukraine, for the region at large, because a lot of people in Ukraine and broader in the world were very skeptical about Lukashenko's promises in the past, where he would say that, oh, I guarantee Ukraine's security in terms of its northern border, for example. And, you know, we can very well understand the skepticism. But nonetheless, that was a factor. And Belarusian, what we call situational neutrality, was an important factor in regional security. Now that Belarus is sort of returning to this one or single dimensional foreign policy, it's not only about skepticism, but it's about what is feasible in Belarusian foreign policy, and most probably even those somewhat vague guarantees of the past will not be feasible. And that means that people in Ukraine, but also in Poland, also in the Baltic states, and also, you know, NATO allies of those countries, including the US, will have to give much more serious thinking to how they ensure the security of the borders, to put it a little bit simplistic. And the very final point, I'm aware of already exceeding my time, but the very final point on Belarusian foreign policy, I'll be short on this. So I think what's happening to Belarusian foreign policy right now is what we've already seen in the past. And this is this kind of cyclical movement from what academics call omnibalancing to hedging, and then back to omnibalancing. Omnibalancing is a concept which explains how authoritarian leaders make foreign policy decisions. And it tells us that the key concern for those leaders is how to stay in power, and then foreign policy should serve that purpose. And, you know, obviously, when you have an authoritarian leader, staying in power is his main concern. The important thing was that in between those periods where he felt his power threatened during previous elections, for example, in 2010, 2011, then there were quite a few years where he thought and he felt quite safe politically. And quite naturally, his foreign policy thinking moved away from omnibalance into what we can call the national interest. And I would even argue that in the last 5-6 years, what Belarus and Lukashenko did in foreign policy was very much in line with Belarus' national interest. And now suddenly we have this rupture, which is explained by the fact that he clearly understands his power is under threat. And now every foreign policy move he makes is just dictated by his need to preserve power. So the West is not his ally in making sure he preserves his power. And Russia, even though Russia has a lot of issues with him, but still supports him for its own reasons. That's why he has again become sort of pro-Russian. But does it mean that he will stay like this forever? Or, you know, does this mean he will stay in power? That's the primary question. But even if he stays in power, we still can see quite a lot of interesting developments in the years to come. But I'll stop at this because of out of time.
Thank you, YAUHENI. Maybe also a short question to you, because you spoke already a little bit about this Belarusian foreign policy becoming, as you named it, single-dimensional, and the fact that the situational neutrality might also be gone or is already gone. I wanted to connect it a little bit to the point, to the fact that previously discussions on Ukraine between Russia and Ukraine within the OSCE framework were happening in Belarus. The trilateral contact groups were traveling here and meeting here. And Belarus was exactly, one might argue, this situationally neutral place where the two neighbors met. Of course, now with the coronavirus, everything is happening online. But when we're out of the pandemic, do you see any way that this communication can resume in Belarus, that Belarus in any sort of way can play a role in it, or it is already an irreversible sort of thing?
Well, I'm a realist in international relations, and I think that there is hardly anything which is irreversible. But of course, the current atmosphere makes it very, very difficult. And of course, you know, our discussion last week with the Ukrainian colleagues, you know, showed that everyone was completely sure that Minsk can no longer serve this negotiation ground for Ukraine peace talks. But we also need to realize that the talks happen here not just by chance. There were some, well, let's say, objective reasons for that. First of all, logistically, it was the best place in all possible ways, but also because it helped Belarus with this argument that as long as we are the venue for peace talks, we shouldn't be directly involved in Russian-Ukrainian confrontation, even though we have very clear bilateral and multilateral commitments with Russia. Now it's a qualitatively different situation, but can we imagine that in some time the discussion might get back to that, and there might be, you know, a space for Belarus to make this argument? I won't preclude it, but obviously this is not something we can have in the weeks and months to come. And thanks God, thanks God, sorry for saying this, but thanks God we have COVID for the time being, because in a way that helps to somehow ease tensions here. But of course, if we have another physical meeting of the contact group in the weeks or months to come, I doubt that it can take place in Belarus. But as I said, objective reasons might still be there to continue.
Thank you. Also, you mentioned in your talk, and this is sort of a bridge to my next speaker, that people in Belarus don't really want geopolitics involved, that it's purely domestic situation, domestic protest against the authoritarian ruler. But again, you said that Russia is very much sort of involved in considering the situation and somehow reacts to it. So YULIA NIKITINA, who's the Associate Professor of World Politics and Research Fellow at the Center of the Post-Soviet Studies at the Moscow State University of International Relations, will speak a little bit more to how Russia sees the situation in Belarus and also in Ukraine, how they deal with revolutions, as some of us already call them, although it's also an interesting issue to discuss what they are, these protests. Yulia, the floor is yours, and I know that you want to share your screen with us to show a presentation.
Yes, thank you, MARYLIA. Good afternoon. Now I will share my screen, and okay, just a second. And now I have some troubles with sharing that. I don't know why. Give me a second. Yes, here it is. So I start, and you see my presentation, right? Thank you. So I will briefly explain what are the Russian views on domestic events in Ukraine and in Belarus from the perspective of Russian political elite. And of course, everyone knows more or less that Russia analyzes those revolutions, color revolutions, the previous wave of color revolutions, from the perspective of some external actions, external reactions, but to me, it seems important to understand the logic of the Russian authorities. What is interesting is that the European Union and the Soviet Union, in a way, share a romantic view on revolutions. So if you look at those pictures on your right, you see this picture from early Soviet years, which is very similar to this famous painting. And in a way, the European Union still has this romantic view. But from the perspective of Russian political elites, we have to look back at all those events and probably acknowledge that the results were quite ambiguous. And that's a step forward for the Russian political elites, I think, for our understanding of the Soviet past. And what is more, there is an understanding that revolutions do bring a lot of positive consequences. And the Soviet revolution actually brought more positive consequences to the West because they had to react to Soviet achievements, to social rights, like paid holidays and so on. And it's interesting that a few years ago, Vladimir Putin acknowledged that the Soviet attempts of exporting social experiments, socialist revolutions, actually that was a failed experiment. And that's also quite important to understand that the causes, according to Putin, were tragic and degradation instead of progress. This is in a way positive in terms of the account of the Soviet experience, but you can see where Putin aims at. So he makes this parallel with democratic revolutions. And the major problem, I would say, from the Russian perspective, from the perspective of the elites, is the incomprehension of Western logic in general. So if we look at some ratings by Freedom House, for example, about free, partially free, not free regimes, Eurasia is the only region in the world which doesn't have any free countries at all. So in all other macro regions, there are some free countries. And generally, the first problem with this logic is that why to export democracy to regions like Eurasia, where democracy doesn't work according to Western rating agencies. Then why topple leaders? So if we talk about the first wave of color revolutions of Georgia, Shevchenko was not an he was quite pro-Western. He wanted Georgia to become at some point a member of NATO and the European Union. So it means that if you are a pro-Western leader, you still cannot get any guarantees that you will not be toppled by a revolution supported morally or politically by the West. And even if you negotiate with the West, nevertheless, you can't have any guarantees that you will not be toppled and you will not have to leave the country. So here, of course, Yanukovych is the case. And that's the vision, that's the conclusions that Russian political elites made from all the previous waves of revolutions. That you cannot trust the West, even if you're pro-Western, even if you negotiate something with the West, there are no guarantees at all that your regime might be safe. And what is more, there is Russia's own experience, which is usually mentioned in this regard, about 1917, but also 1991, which are considered to be national catastrophes and collapses of statehood. I'll stop my presentation here and just add a few ideas. So if those are collapses of statehood, then actually MYKOLA mentioned existential threats, that Russia is perceived as an existential threat to Ukraine. So from the perspective of Russian political elites or social all types of social unrest are also perceived as existential threat. But that's a struggle not between Russia and Ukraine or Russia and, say, Belarusian opposition. That's a struggle between Russia and the West in general. So that's higher level of contradictions. And what is most interesting is that if we look back to the first reactions of Russian political elites to the first wave of revolutions in 2003-2005, Putin and Lavrov gave the following explanation: that the revolutions happened when governments lost touch with reality and lost contact with societies. So actually, there was quite a clear understanding of the reasons of those revolutions, and those were numerous comments of that kind. So you can make your own conclusions about that. On Armenia, so Zhenya mentioned Armenia, that Russia actually is quite neutral in relation to this revolution, and the explanation is that this revolution in Armenia is perceived as absolutely domestic affair, while the events in Belarus are perceived through the lenses of support of the Baltic states, Poland, to the Belarusian opposition. So then again, we go one level up, and from a domestic conflict, it becomes a global conflict and an existential threat. And one last probably comment on the Slavic Brotherhood, because it was mentioned in the announcement of our program. So in Russia, for very many years, this notion of Slavic Brotherhood was taken for granted, that we do not need to invest any funding into supporting that, any money into soft power. So that is why Russia lost Eurasian countries, neighboring countries, before all those events started to happen, simply because, well, friendship requires funding, fortunately or unfortunately. So in order to support, like with friends, you would go to a cafeteria and take some coffee and discuss something. So it needs time, it needs at least some money, and we need these days to talk more in terms of national dialogue, so not only contacts at the high level, but also at the levels of society, if we want to keep this triangle together, not in terms of geopolitics, but in terms of social interactions. So this is very important. And I hope that political elites in all three countries and societies will come to the same conclusion, and our social contacts will continue regardless of the political situations in all countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yulia. A lot of interesting thoughts. And for me, for example, what was very surprising is when you said that the events in Belarus are perceived through this lens of the Baltic support to Belarusian opposition, which is completely, in my understanding of the situation in Belarus, not the case. This is not how it started, and this is not, maybe the Baltics sort of picked up on it, but it wasn't the trigger. It wasn't in any case the first thing that came there. So this is very new to me. Thank you. And another thing about the Slavic Brotherhood, I just recalled a book by Dmitry Trenin. I think he wrote it like in the 2000s, and one of the things that he says there is that for Russia, Belarus and Ukraine are so important for its identity that this is a very, very difficult thing for Russia to sort of reinvent its relations with these two newly independent countries. So maybe like if you can shortly somehow comment on this identity thing, how do you see Russia reinventing this identity right now with what's happening in Belarus and how the relations played out in Ukraine? A very broad question, but
yeah, that's the most difficult question. I'm not sure anyone knows the answer, but with the identity, in Russia, we still have troubles with national identity because we don't have any special legislation. There were ideas to introduce a law on nation in Russia, but there were too many contradictions and disputes about that. So what is a Russian nation? Россияне, like who are Россияне? And that's why if we are not absolutely sure what are the basic things that keep us together as a nation, then it's rather difficult to suggest any model for positive example for neighboring countries, and to say that, okay, here are our basic values, basic things that keep us together, so let's talk about them. Probably you have similar I don't know, similar values or whatever. So the term value itself becomes toxic when you use it in Russia in the political context, because that's perceived from the lenses of Western values versus Russian traditional values. So what we need to reinvent our understanding of basic grounds on which all societies function. So probably we need even to reinvent the language that we use when we talk about social relations, in order not to over politicize this language, and to talk about shared problems and not about disputed interpretations.
Thank you very much, Yulia. And all of you, if any of you has some further comments, you can just come in. MYKOLA, you seem to be waving.
Yeah, I've noticed a very interesting question from Yuri.
Perfect.
About whether it would be better for the region if Russia changes its approach and abandons the policy of protecting its strategic interests. I generally follow the footsteps of YAUHENI and also take a realist approach to international politics and react to what we actually observe on the ground than to scenarios.
MYKOLA, I think we lost him, right? Or is it only me?
Everyone would be better off.
Sorry to interrupt you. You were frozen for a while. Can you please start
Okay.
from the beginning?
I will start from the point that, first of all, I think that the situation is different from what we have with today's Russia, comparing to what we had with the Austro-Hungarian Empire after the World War I. And second of all, I think everyone would better off if Russia applied a different policy of protecting. Let it have its own sphere of interests. Every state might perceive its national interests and threats in the way it perceives it does. But the question is in choosing the instruments. There are some fundamental rules about international security which one should not, in a way, break. I do understand Yulia's notion that Russia has taken revolutions in neighboring countries as an existential threat. Okay, react to this threat, but do it within some limits, because otherwise your reaction provoke threats which are even bigger than those which you were facing before. And also I would add that this kind of perception, if you perceive your neighbors' threats and possibilities in the zero-sum game manner, does create a very dangerous environment. So this installs security dilemmas in relations with your neighbors, and in the end, you find yourself in a position which is actually worse than it has been before. You were fighting for your security, but in the end, you find yourself insecure more than secure. That's my point.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Maybe also in relation to that, there is another question for Yulia concerning exporting revolution.
Yes, I read the question.
Yeah, maybe I will just announce it for the audience, because I'm not sure if they can see it. The question says whether exporting revolution, of course, it's not a good idea, but do you, Yulia, consider revolutions in 2014 in Belarus, in Ukraine, and now in Belarus as exported? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. No, my point was not that there's revolutions in 2014 and the current social unrest in Belarus were exported from the West. My point was that Russian political elites perceive it that way, and they act accordingly. And their perception is that without external organizational and managerial support, social groups, protesters in the streets wouldn't have been so organized. So probably it makes a hint at the understanding of the Russian political elites towards the social groups, that the society itself in Russia and in Eurasia in general, post-Soviet societies cannot be that much organized on their own, that they need some management from without. So that might be the internal understanding and internal logic within Russian political elites. And then there was one question about Oman and communist administration in Belarus. So what happened if the opposition succeeds, and will they go to Russia? So there are some examples, like former leaders of Kyrgyzstan, for example. One of them lives in Russia, President Tokayev. Kyiv lives in Belarus, so that's quite a common practice. And generally, I think that the most important question here is the question of the so-called transitional justice. What do we do about the administrations which come in place of the previous administrations? So MYKOLA might comment on the situation in Ukraine, but it seems to me that in all the post-Soviet countries, there is no idea how to deal with the previous administrations. Like Saakashvili is under investigation, like there are claims against Poroshenko and so on. So, and this lack of predictability for the current leaders makes them tougher in relation to the opposition and against any attempt of toppling themselves.
Thank you. YAUHENI, maybe would you like to add? Yeah, I see you raising your hand, so go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just quickly wanted to add to what Yulia said in terms of this idea of sort of Western involvement in all sorts of domestic affairs being a perception on the Russian side. I think I totally agree that, you know, it is a perception, and if we want to analyze the situation to look for ways out, we cannot simply ignore it. But I think it's not only about this perception, it's also perhaps even more about the lack of trust. Unfortunately, we've reached this point in Russia-Western relations where almost zero space exists for any sort of agreements which are even broadly associated with, you know, geopolitics in the post-Soviet space primarily. And even though I'm quite sure that all those professionals on the Russian side who deals with facts on the ground, and that's part of their job, have a clear understanding of what exactly is going on, for example, in Belarus. But because of this lack of trust, politically, they and their political leadership, in a way, even have to buy and then publicly promote this argument about Western interference. And in this respect, it has created a situation where, for example, I think it was only rational for Alexander Lukashenko, given that, you know, his main concern, as I said before, under these circumstances is to stay in power. So I'm not just saying that it was a good thing he did it. I'm just trying to explain what he was doing in a pragmatic and a rational way. So it was only rational for him, given that his ultimate idea was to survive this period of political crisis in Belarus, to refer to the Russians saying that, oh, look, this is not just about a domestic situation. It is about a Western-inspired attempt of a call it revolution. And if we fall now, that's what he said, then you Russians will be next. And then, you know, in a way, he enmeshed Moscow with this, even though, of course, you know, he's now as weak as perhaps never before, but he even could use that whole situation to enmesh Moscow into some kind of, you know, arrangements where Moscow had to go on with him.
If I may, just one sentence in reaction
All
to
right.
Evgeny's last point. Indeed, in late 2019, the relations between Moscow and Minsk were in very poor condition. And before the elections, Lukashenko tried to enmesh the European Union against Russia with all this story with the private security company. But afterwards, he chose the opposite strategy to enmesh Russia.
Thank you, Yulia. MYKOLA, you were raising your hand, I think. Go ahead. There is also a question in chat. I don't know if that's the one that you wanted to address, but it's about OSCE, SMM in Ukraine, so maybe you can also tackle that.
Absolutely. I will be reacting to Stephanie's question about monitoring mission. Also very glad to see you, Stephanie, or at least to read your question. So in my view, the basic problem with the mission is that it has a very narrow mandate and has absolutely no power to even to observe the regime which has been so many times tried to be installed in the contact over the contact line. So what a monitoring mission does is reporting about breaking of ceasefire, reporting of shellings, without even indicating who has been responsible. Because of that, it has not been trusted by either side. The Ukrainians do not trust because, in their opinion, the monitoring mission does not say that pro-Russian forces are opening fire against Ukrainian soldiers, and the same thing is happening on the opposite side of the contact line. So the fundamental problem is about the mandate, and whatever attempts we have made to establish a ceasefire, whatever papers we have been writing, the major point there was the extension of the mandate of the mission in order to impose an effective ceasefire.
Yeah, I think the part of this question was also about whether Belarus, whether OSCE could somehow engage in Belarus more actively. Yevhen, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, that's exactly what I wanted to respond to. I think it's not just about Russia, and as far as Russia is concerned, it doesn't seem to be particularly enthusiastic about a potential OSCE involvement in Belarus. But I would even say that a bigger sort of blocking card is on Lukashenko's side here, and he is obviously against this. First of all, I think he's always against any kind of sort of international mediation attempts or ideas, because he clearly sees that as a situation where he can no longer control everything himself. But of course, we can then imagine a situation where even he has to acknowledge the facts on the grounds that his level of support is no longer what it used to be, and that he has to enter into some kind of negotiation. Under those circumstances, could a possible OSCE mission be an option? And this is, by the way, exactly the discussion which was there in the second half of August, when, as I mentioned before, there was this growing feeling both inside Belarus but also outside that Lukashenko was so weak that he would fall very quickly. And then the idea came up about a potential OSCE mediation. But I think there was another problem with that. And the problem has to do with what exactly the mediation was going to be about. And here we had two completely different approaches. One by the protest side, which was the mediation is about a new free and fair election. Given what happened at the beginning of August, and mainly the violence by the police and law enforcement agencies, it was very clear that any new election would ultimately mean that Lukashenko would lose, even though, we don't really have the exact numbers about how the people voted in the election. And some people would say that perhaps, he still got a lot of votes. And we don't know that. But after the violence at the beginning of August, it was clear that there was no way for him to win. And that's why this idea of a new quick election became a no-go for him. So he was going to do everything possible to stop this. Whereas then there might potentially be a different dimension of involvement, which has to do with this longer-term idea of a constitutional reform, which Lukashenko himself is trying to promote. Whether he is eager and willing to somehow get the OSCE involved is still an open question, even though at this point I think the answer is no. But perhaps, if the situation continues to be difficult and the authorities are not able to enforce their agenda on opposition and the protests, some options might emerge in the future, even though I wouldn't be too optimistic about that. But I think what I wanted to emphasize, we need to understand this difference between the two agendas. One, immediate election, because the previous one is illegitimate, and then Lukashenko's agenda is about, okay, let's turn over the pages, he usually says, and talk about a longer-term constitutional reform and a national dialogue.
Thank you, Jochen. I must notice also that as far as I remember the events in August, the opposition was also initially for the dialogue on a transition, some sort of transition. They didn't immediately demand the elections. It was later on when Lukashenko completely dismissed this idea that they decided also to go only for new elections. And that's what they're demanding right now.
But I actually think that it was, the idea of this transition was still about Lukashenko leaving. Because even if you look at the wording that the Coordination Council used when it was established, the wording was the Coordination Council for arranging a transition of power, which obviously means that it should arrange Lukashenko's departure, which was not particularly acceptable for Lukashenko, who had some other ideas for his own future.
Okay, perfect. Yulia, I see you raising your hands, but I would like to pose a question exactly to you, and that would be the last question before our closing round because we're already behind the time. So the question comes from Hannes Svoboda, and he asks a little bit, you wanted to answer it. So I just say very quickly, the Caucasus, what happened there? Has Russia been weakened, strengthened? And whether it plays some role in in the relation of Russia to Ukraine and Belarus?
Yes, thank you. That's a great question about what's happening in the Caucasus. So Nagorno-Karabakh indeed will be perceived as a test for Russian partnership for all its allies. So Russia is a reliable partner, military partner or economic partner. So now we see that after the agreement was signed, and now there will be Russian peacekeepers in the region. So it might, on the one hand, give an impression that Russia still plays the most important role in the region. But some other people might think that, but Armenia lost this conflict generally, and Nagorno-Karabakh had to give back some of the territories to to the control of Azerbaijani forces. So does it mean that Russia was really supportive of Armenia or not? So I don't think there is one answer to this question. So every actor in Eurasia will understand the situation according to their perceptions, and this situation will reinforce them in their previous understandings of whether Russia is a reliable partner or not. So that's why, indeed, that will be kind of a test ground, but I'm not sure about what will follow from that.
And any implications for Ukraine or Belarus, if you can add anything on that?
No, I don't think there should be any implications. So generally, when we try to find some common patterns in Russian foreign policy towards different sub-regions in Eurasia, well, I would say that academically, analytically, we will fail to do it because somewhere, like with Nagorno-Karabakh, Russia supports the idea of the territorial integrity of Azerbaijan, and the same would be true for Transnistria and the Russian official position, while in other cases, we see that Russia recognized the independence of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. So for that reason, I don't think that we should expect any long-term consequences for Belarus and Ukraine.
Thank you very much. I think we can close here. I would maybe ask you all to add some, conclusive comment. I would like to offer you maybe some options. Maybe you want to comment on something that was said before and you wanted to add on it. Or I would also like to pose you as as an alternative the question that actually we have in the title of this event, which says, or it's not formulated as a question there, but it says Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, between the common past and an uncertain future. So we discussed the relations between Belarus, Ukraine, which are at a new low right now. We discussed Ukraine and Russia, and for Russia, it seems that Ukraine is lost and the other way around. And then Belarus and Russia is also in a new situation where the Russian government supports Lukashenko, but Lukashenko has a lot of domestic problems. So how do you see this all trends playing out in the region and between the countries? Maybe I will start with MYKOLA. Yeah.
Such difficult questions you pose, Marylia, but they are good because they help generalize. And I think that we still face, if we face a choice between common past and uncertain future, it certainly will be much closer to uncertain future, because past in this story does not play on the side of stabilization and trust and mutual cooperation and all good things which help arrange an effective, well-functioning regional system of security. Instead, we have a very complicated set of disputes, the issues which are impossible to reach any agreement so far. We have practically no zone of possible agreement in relations, at least between Russia and Ukraine. And we have a very unstable and very vulnerable security, national security for each of these countries. And even on the example of Nagorno-Karabakh, we can't really conclude that that was something which played in favor of any of the countries. The result was only multiplying of risks, and any decision which Russia has been facing in this situation was a bad decision. It had to choose between several bad decisions, and that will be a common situation for, I believe, all three countries in the nearest future.
Thank you. YAUHENI, would you like to continue?
I actually agree with what MYKOLA said, so I'll add something broader. I think one fundamental factor which, besides everything else we've discussed today, explains the tumultuous nature of what's happening in the region is, of course, structural, and it has to do with the fact that the system of international relations is going through a fundamental transformation. We don't yet know where exactly it will arrive, and it's a different subject, but the very process of the transformation has two clear implications, including which explain what is going on among between our countries and in the region. The first one is institutional. It has to do with the fact that the institutions which were there in the 90s, including the OSCE, which were the bedrocks of that international system, very successful, extremely advanced, and they contributed a lot to peace and security in Europe. They are no longer able to perform their previous function because, again, as I said, the system is under transformation. The institutions which were fine-tuned to serve the previous system just are losing momentum. Unfortunately, for smaller states, at least when I talk about Belarus, it means that we can no longer rely on laws and agreements in international affairs, and everything becomes a little bit like a forest. Secondly, it also means, as we discussed before, that trust is gone. And as trust is gone, countries are trying to understand where the real balances today lie and how they sort of might improve their future position. That has to do primarily with some originally key actors like Russia. And when you have a situation of non-functional institutions on the one hand, and then countries trying to understand what the new balances might be, that of course creates the most dangerous environment for all sorts of conflicts, including military conflicts. Unfortunately, I think we're posed to see more and more of that in the region and broader in Eurasia. And under these circumstances, unfortunately, all our countries will experience this not only uncertainty, but the certainty will be about all those troubles. And we can, in a way, only hope that all this will not get too bad.
Well, indeed, that's a very difficult question, but I don't know about the future, but I'm sure.
Thank you, Yulia, can you?
Yeah, so thank you. So I'm not sure about the future, but I'm sure that our past is uncertain and unpredictable, because Yuri also made a comment about some historic disputes about identity, Slavic brotherhood, and so on. So we are now having a lot of memory wars, and that's our new reality. And what I would like to be sure about is that I would rather have some disputes and debates related to identities rather than geopolitics. So previously, we have been talking a lot about relations in our part of the world from the geopolitical perspective. I think it's time to switch more to the issues related to identity, and understanding ourselves, our own nations, is the key issue here, to understand what we want. And when we formulate it for ourselves, then I think it will be easier to talk to each other from this new perspective.
Thank you very much, Yulia. Thank you very much, MYKOLA, and thank you very much, YAUHENI, for this amazing discussion. I really enjoyed it. And so this gives me another sort of idea that we should actually rephrase our title between uncertain past and uncertain future, which I guess invites us all to live in the moment and at least enjoy what we have. There is always some optimism that can be found anywhere in any sort of situation. So thank you again, all of you, and thanks a lot to our audience for being with us, for posing your interesting questions. And I wish you all a great day, evening, or morning, wherever you are. And I hope to see you again at our next event. Thank you all. Bye-bye.